Welcome to our St John's Tide online gathering. Just while we wait for a few more people to arrive, just as for those of you who are returning, welcome back. For those of you who have not joined us before, just a few technical things, which I just went through a few minutes ago, but for those of you who just heard of it, I will just go through it again. My name is Fiona Campbell, and I'm hosting this evening's gathering on behalf of the Anthroposophical Society in Australia. So when we have the presenters on, we keep everybody on mute for our mutual comfort. But you can go to introduce yourself at the chat function. If you're not familiar with that, it's at the bottom of the screen, and you just click on that and you'll find a little message box will come up, and you can type in your message and you hit it either with the return or the enter bar on your keyboard. So it'd be nice if everybody could say hello to each other. So before we start, tonight's program is on the theme of change your heart, change your mind, which is really encompassing the whole St. John the Baptist theme of changing our way of thinking when we try to make straight our path in order for not only our own spiritual development, for the development of all of humanity. And we have three speakers who I'll introduce after the verse. And then we have, instead of breakout rooms, which most of you might be used to, we're going to have a selection of artworks. So I am highlighting, or I'm presenting artworks from various members of the art section who've sent me their work. Some of them are here today, I think, some of them aren't. And we'll be looking at those as a kind of a silent contemplation for the, in the latter part of the presentation. And then there will be a couple of announcements, more practical announcements about future events. And then we expect to finish in around about 6 o'clock or just after. So I'm going to start by lighting a candle. If you have a candle, you might want to light one too. From Kate West, followed by a verse by Steiner, spoken by Yasushi Hayashi. Kate, over to you if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I have. Thank you, Fiona. I'm speaking to you today from Aranda country. Mbantwa is the Aranda name, otherwise known as Alice Springs. I would like to acknowledge that we meet today on Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to their elders past and present and emerging. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this country. Thank you.
In the heart, there lives a part of the human being, which contains the matter that is most spiritual of all. A part that lives most spiritually, in the way that the most material reveals itself. Hence, the heart is the sun in the human microcosm. Hence, in the heart, the human being most of all finds the deepest fount of its being.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Yasushi. So we have, as I said earlier, 3 presenters. Lynne Klugman is going to open our gathering with Lynne Klugman from Melbourne, then Jennifer West from Central Australia, and then Cheryl Nekvapil from Melbourne. Lynne, over to you if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose land I am presently seated. I'm next to the Yanga Baring Reserve, home to the black cockatoo. So here we are with our theme, Change Our Hearts, Change Our Minds. And we're gathered together close to midwinter in the south and midsummer in the north. I came to realize their significance firstly through being born during the summer solstice. I was born in South Africa, and I had 2 key experiences in relation to the solstices when I was still quite young. One was going to a very large monument in South Africa, and the other was going to an ancient mystery centre in Ireland. So the first one was being taken to the Voortrekker monument outside Pretoria when I was around 7 or 8 years old. And this was a birthday treat for me to experience how the summer solstice sun shone down through an aperture in the roof directly onto the relief of a Voortrekker on the floor below. And so I came to realize that there was such a thing as a solstice, and that this was connected with the sun, and that I was connected with it through being born on that day. The second one was being taken to Newgrange in Ireland on my 21st birthday. Now, at that point, I was in the Northern Hemisphere, and it was the time of the winter solstice. I was taken by family friends who lived in Ireland. I had never heard of Newgrange, but I had the experience of being taken through the doorway into a long passageway that led to a tomb or chamber in the center of the mound. I experienced how the long, low winter sun found its way into the chamber just at this point in the year. What a mystery this was to me. It was around 18 months later, but my first winter solstice after this experience, when I was back in the south of Africa, that I met anthroposophy. It would take many years of being a student of anthroposophy till I was able to penetrate a little further into the mysteries of these 2 great sun events that take place in our year. And now, through the gifts I've received from anthroposophy, I'd like to explore briefly some of these insights and to share 2 quotes from Rudolf Steiner that are like keys to me. If I could have the first slide, Fiona. So the first quote, people must once more learn to think the spiritual together with the course of nature. From the Calendar of the Soul, 1912. And the second one, by finding the right inward festival mood, men will also again be able to hold converse with the gods and link human existence with divine existence. And if we could have the chart now, thank you. So here is a chart. It's taken from lecture 5 of the cycle of the year, and I've added colour and the names of the 4 archangels related to the seasons in the centre of the chart, together with a kind of lemniscate movement, which I imagine taking place between them. I wish to focus on midsummer in the heights, as it is taking place in the north of the earth, and on midwinter in the depths, as it is taking place in the south of the earth at this moment. So reading from the chart from above downwards, we find first the cardinal Platonic virtue of wisdom at the top, spiritual wisdom, enlightenment. And connected to this is moral impulse, moral impulse. At St. John's Tide, we're told to change our hearts, change our minds. And in this time of midsummer, we are to receive the light. Here we have the activity of the Archangel Uriel above. He's in the heights above, working from there, clothed in the light, but gazing down at the deeds of man with his grave countenance. We then come to Gabriel, Gabriel in the south of the earth, and we are admonished to be aware of evil at midwinter, to beware of how we face temptation through evil. So the spiritual wisdom of midsummer becomes the consolidating of intellect at midwinter. At this point of beholding evil, we're urged to employ the cardinal Platonic virtue of temperance. Temperance, the binding of our passions so that they serve rather than hinder our will. If we imagine how Gabriel in winter rules above as the cosmic archangel with a mild and loving look and a gesture of benediction, we can perhaps even feel how the heavenly Madonna appears, embracing the earth and all beings. And at the same time, Gabriel sends his forces through the earth to the north, and Uriel sends his forces through the earth to the south, coming to stand by our side with his judicial gaze and warning gesture as we face evil within and without. At this time of COVID-19, which is a world event, we are enjoined to face evil, both within and without. We can leave the slide now. Thank you, Fiona. Not yet, dear. We are enjoined to change our hearts and to change our minds. Novelist and Noongar man Kim Scott calls for a re-weaving of our moral fibre. a reweaving of our moral fibre. This is something that we can take very deeply into our being. What does it mean to reweave our moral fibre? What will it take to do that both inwardly and outwardly, in whatever capacity we have, to make a contribution to social change, to environmental change, to all the change that is needed now? This is a very deep question, and it comes to us at this very deep time of the year, in the midst of a very deep crisis. So how are we to face this? I love this image of the reweaving of our moral fibre. It speaks to us of having fibres, and that these are our moral fibres, of the warp and weft of our souls, and of how perhaps we can bring in new colours, refine aspects of our threads, and work towards something that is transformative, that brings in a totally new dimension. It's a reweaving of all that we are, of all that we know, of all that we can achieve. And now I'd like to change to a slide of a child's drawing. So just to complete this sharing with you today, I'd like also to share with you a drawing by a young grandson of mine. He turned 8 this month and had a sleepover at our house a couple of weeks ago. In the morning, he told me that he'd had a really big dream. He spent quite a long time talking about this dream and sharing it with me. And so I asked him if he would like to draw it, which he did. So a few days later, he presented me with this drawing, which is here for you to see. He said that he was robed in the metals, gold, silver, copper, and bronze. Different parts of his armor contained these metals, and that he was facing what he has drawn as a B, B for bad, an opponent whom he met in this dream and whom he was required to battle against. And on that note, I will leave you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynne. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer West from Central Australia. I was going to say Alice Springs, but in fact, I'm not entirely sure if I should say Alice Springs, or rather, as Kate introduced us to the actual correct, the correct name of the area, but I shall leave that to Jennifer to say that for us. So Jennifer, if you'd like to unmute yourself, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Fiona. And thanks, Lynne. That was really a good sort of introduction to some of the things I was going to speak about. So thank you for that. I am speaking to you today from the ASinA country, and the name of the place is Bantua. And yes, so Kate has done the acknowledgement already. So we are in this turning point of the year where we turn from the darkness towards the light. And in doing that, we can think about, well, what is it that we are moving towards? Because this year has been an extraordinary year for the whole world. There is no question that we have all experienced change. And so the COVID-19 changes have really affected everybody in one way or another, either through the restrictions of things like the travel, meetings, how many people we can have meeting together, places we can go. When I came here to Alice Springs, we were in isolation for 2 weeks. So some people have had to experience that. And of course, there's all the what's called the social distancing and so on. So everybody has had some level of disruption and so on to the way of life. And I think I'm sure that everybody has thought a lot about what's happened in their particular case. But I think it's good sometimes to really sit and think, just sit with the changes that have happened and think about them. And I invite you to do this, not now, but later on, when you have time, because I want to link it up to what I finish off with today. So, yeah, I think we're much more aware now of the attitudes and behaviours and so on that are in the world that have been there for quite some time, but maybe we're noticing them more intensively now. So things like the injustice, the racism and so on, that's called forth the Black Lives Matter protests and so on. The inequalities that are in our right throughout our world today, all the lying that goes on, perhaps what seems superficial becomes the way we talk about things now. We don't go so deeply into things perhaps. And we may feel through some of these things that we're becoming disconnected a bit from reality, or we might even feel indifference or boredom or whatever. So all of those sorts of things we can become quite aware of. And so again, I'd like to suggest that if you have the time and the interest, you might like to again look at what have you recognised in yourself that you have experienced in this way, and you may want to take further in some way. So if we go back to the time of John the Baptist and the call that he made to people of that time to change their ways, to open their hearts, open their minds, he was calling them to become ready to receive the Christ. And the Christ came, and then he went through the death and the resurrection, and then he was in the etheric world and became the Lord of the elements and the Lord of karma. And I think both of these are quite prominent today. So we'll have a look at those realms a little bit later. But where has this call, is that call finished now? And when I was thinking about this, I thought, if I, look at Rudolf Steiner's work and all that he brought through anthroposophy, I think ringing through that is another call, a call to us again to change our hearts, change our minds, awaken. He was calling us to awaken to our responsibilities and to really look at what we have to do in regard to both the earth, so the elemental world and more of the nature world, and also in our caring for others. So both of these, I think, are really important. We need to wake up to our responsibility. And many people, that's exactly what's happening. So you have a lot of changes going on with people who are caring about the environment, the ecology, sustainability, and all those movements and so on. And I think this call from Steiner became very urgent in his last year of life. And at the Christmas Foundation meeting, he brought a meditation for all of us that he laid in our hearts, the Foundation Stone meditation, which encompasses so much. When you work with it, you realise it goes to the depths, to the heights, to the widths, and out into the elemental world and out into the individual and so on. So there's a lot to work with in that one. But then he gave all the Karma lectures and the classwork for the School of Spiritual Science. He gave courses for priests, for the farmers, for doctors, and so on. He gave the speech and drama course. And you know, he gave so much during that last year of his life. I think he was saying to us, the time is urgent. So the difference, however, is that back in the time of John the Baptist, we had a very different soul disposition. We were not so aware of ourselves as individuals. We were much more embedded in our community, which was based around family and tribe and so on, the blood relations. But now it's quite different, because in those 2,000 years, there's been quite a change in terms of the development of our own individual self and our awareness of ourself. And that's been part of what has needed to happen. But our connection to community is now to be a different one. So we now connect to a freely chosen community. And that has to be, all of that has to be strengthened. So we come to an awareness that these forces, they're both of them are within us. One is an antisocial force, which is the development of us as an individual, where we're focused on ourselves. That's an antisocial focus. And the other is, for the community, is a social awareness, where we do look and care about others and so on, and the earth. So could I have the first slide, please, Fiona? Yeah. So this is something that came from Bob Williams, who was a General Secretary of the Australian Society back in the 70s and I know into the early 80s. And he brought this picture. He said, we look at the daisy and we think, what a beautiful flower. We see the big white petals. And you can see, if you look, certain threefoldness in them. But then he said, look at the centre. And he said, each one of those, so beautifully arranged in this wonderful spiral, each one of those is actually also a flower. And you can see around the outside how they're beginning to open up and blossom, so that the whole is made up of the many individual flowers. And it's been something that I've lived with all these years and really begun to understand what it is that, you know, in a way our direction needs to be, that we become a strong eye, so that we can contribute to the community in the best way we can. And those of you who know the Healthy Social Life verse, it's expressed through that as well, or through the expression from South Africa of Ubuntu, which is, I am because you are. So I think we can use that as something to just remind us, yes, it requires both individual development and community development. So when we come to look at the individual development, it's often seen as looking at our work in our thinking, our feeling and our willing that needs to be done. And when we go into that, we will encounter three counter forces. They're known sometimes as three beasts. There's a saying that says, to overcome evil, make energetic progress towards the good. And I think that can help us to find the way in which we can encounter these counter forces, because it's really in encountering them and working to overcome them, in that striving, we become stronger. And if we become stronger, we have more to contribute then to the community. So the three are known as fear, hate, and doubt. And in a way, fear is the signature of our time. We really, all of us live with fear deep within us, and it's part of what belongs to us in this age. And so we need to look at what can we develop in ourselves to help meet this fear and overcome it. And of course, it's courage. So there's, I think earlier on in one of the other gatherings, somebody mentioned the verse for our time, sometimes known as the Michael verse. And I will put it in the notes that come afterwards with this talk for those who haven't seen it. But it talks there about, that it's what we have to do now is to learn to work out of pure trust, trusting in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. So it's this working with the spirit that's actually really helps us to overcome these three counter forces. So with the hate, if we can develop an inner warmth, a fiery inner enthusiasm, that can counter those forces of hate. And we draw those forces, the good forces, from the spirit. And likewise in our thinking, if we look at what is needed there, we need clarity of thinking, and we need to develop a good creative way of looking at things. So they are the three that help us as individually we develop ourselves. But in doing that, we strengthen what is needed for the community. So in closing, I'd just like to mention something I've participated in the past few months, or further back than that as well, but particularly the past few months, the work of Otto Scharmer, where he and his associates have had this, what they have called the Gaia journey. And Gaia stands for Global Activation of Intention and Action. And there's also a reference to that in the notes if you want to follow that up. But I'm sure that a number of you will have been participating too. And in there, there was, it's clear from what these people do that problems are not seen as, oh, something you must just solve. They're seen as the source for bringing something new. So, it's not like, oh, you have to repair something or replace it. You actually bring something new. And in that way, you can begin to bring something new into the world for the future. So there was one of the sessions, there were 3 Aboriginal elders who were speaking from the Noongar people in Western Australia. And one of them, Dr. Noel Nannup, he talked about how the greatest insights can come through reflection. And he also then spoke about something, he gave a picture of how we're all on this path, this journey together, and we all have pieces of the path taking us into the future. And if we take these pieces and we shape them and we polish them and we put them back into the path, that helps to shape and give direction for the future, and it changes the way the path emerges. So I want to now conclude with something that connects with that. It's a meditation that comes from another Aboriginal elder. Many of you may have come across this before. The elder is Miriam Rose Ballman, and she's from the Northern Territory. She's from the Daly River area. And she talked about the importance of actually going and sitting with yourself, and she often does it in nature, and just sitting quietly and connecting with the spring, the well springs, so that you can actually settle yourself and gain your direction. So could I have the last slide, please, Fiona? So this is known as the Diri, and this is not the whole thing that she speaks about. I'd like to just acknowledge Greg Burgess here. He showed me the meditation has more to it than just these 3 lines, but I wanted to just use these 3 because they are often used on their own. To know me is to breathe with me. To breathe with me is to listen deeply. To listen deeply is to connect. So this breathing, it's really important. Steiner spoke about how we would begin to notice that as we breathe with people, it changes their breathing, and that's known now in the world. And he said this will increase up into the 6th epoch. So it's not something that's just something, oh yes, we know all about it now. There's more to come. And this listening deeply, so many people now really are aware of the importance of this deep listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So for our last speaker, Cheryl Nekvapil, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Jennifer. It's quite beautiful to see how, even though we prepare our presentations independently, how they do this interweaving, that it's a great affirmation of spiritual activity. So the points that I'll be sort of gathering together, Lynn mentioned this with this verse of Steiner's, that people must once more learn to think. I want to really look at thinking and to converse with the gods, so human existence can meet with divine existence. So both those elements, hopefully, I touch on. And this whole picture of that within and without we face evil, and looking at our contribution to change at this time. Points that I hope illustrate through the little bit that I have to say. And also Jennifer talked about the inner working enabling us to work in the outer world and coming into community. So those themes are in a very simple, light touch, I hope are also taken up in what I've prepared. This theme of change your heart, change your mind, as has been said, comes from Matthew chapter 3, verse 2, where John the Baptist is said to say, "Repent, for nigh at hand is the kingdom of heaven." And this word repent comes from the Greek metanoia, And the way we have rendered it is to say metanoia refers to a change of heart and a change of mind. But I'd like to consider particularly this change of mind and actually how the change of mind works into our soul so that our intentions and our will can change, and also can work into our heart forces so that the powers of our feeling and our heart can change. So I want to approach it through thinking. First of all, from a fairly everyday practical picture, and then how that impacts socially, and then maybe an approach we can take to the social situation. So Rudolf Steiner really looked at this, what he called practical thinking, and I'd like to call it genuine practical thinking. And he spoke about this in a lecture that he gave, which is entitled Practical Training in Thought, and he gave it in Karlsruhe on the 18th of January 1909. And there he talks, some of you, I think many of you probably remember this lecture, where he talks about the comments that were made about the invention of stamps and the introduction of trains and the railway. So I want to take something that's a bit closer to us today, but to look at, to illustrate this. But first of all, his quote, which is, "We must clearly distinguish between genuine thinking and so-called practical thinking, that is merely reasoning in traditional ruts of thought." I'll just say that again. Steiner says, we must clearly distinguish between genuine thinking and so-called practical thinking, that is merely reasoning in traditional ruts of thought. I think it's very provocative. So this came to my mind when in the last few months, I was thinking about the bicycle. And this came to my mind because just before the restrictions started, there was a radio program talking about the statistics for unemployed youth between the ages of 16 and 24. And I thought, oh, that's, our grandson is 16 and he's working, but he's really well employed because he's working in a bicycle shop, selling bicycles, maintaining bicycles, and they're busier than ever. And in fact, his employer has offered him permanent part-time work, even though he's a full-time high school student. So I thought, oh, well, I'm going to think about bicycles. And they were first, well, at least if you put a starting line on it, was first invented in 1817 by a German baron called Karl von Drais in Baden-Württemberg. And Karl von Drais invented this simple vehicle because there'd been a very significant volcanic eruption that had affected the climate, and they had a terrible drought, and horses were dying of hunger and thirst. And so he set about to try and invent a ready form of transport for people. And in the following years, there was further development done on it. And over that time in the 1800s, it was from time to time called a bone shaker. Apparently it was rather an uncomfortable vehicle. But after 70 years, by the mid-1890s, it had been so developed that it was a popular, accessible form of transport, both in terms of its use and its price, and it was being used of people of all ages for transport as well as for recreation. So at that time, so this is a picture of someone's thinking that responds to the time by bringing in a new thought. Jennifer mentioned Otto Scharmer in challenging us to bring in new thought. So the Baron brought in new thought with this invention of a bicycle. And of course, there's all sorts of inventions happening today that we are subject to. So the other side of an invention and a thought that becomes so practical is that we have a response or a reaction to that invention, and our thinking can go all sorts of ways. And I thought about that in terms of my childhood in rural Victoria, 140 years after the bicycle was first invented, that it was only children and teenagers who rode bicycles. Because here, like elsewhere in the world, it was considered a poor person's transport, and the car far outshone the bicycle. But here we have this situation today where the selling and use of bicycles is booming, because it's now considered a quiet, environmentally friendly, efficient, health promoting form of transport for everybody. So those attitudes towards the bicycle when I was a child, you know, weren't actually, you could say, genuine thinking, because given one's disposition to think about a technological introduction to the world or what's happening, is we realize that you could say our constitutional response is something we have to take into account. So people thought that cars were the thing, whereas really, probably the progressive thinkers might have been the people riding bicycles, if you get my gist. So I think when we're reacting to or when we're responding to something new that comes into society, it's worth looking at ourselves to try to recognize our thinking. Are we thinking in a particular rut, as Steiner put it? Are we conservative, reactionary, progressive, fantastical, or genuinely practical? And this lovely thought that that Jennifer made, that we need clarity in our thinking. I think there's a lot of thinking we need to do to branch out from the default thinking in society around us. So we've got invention as a change in thinking, and on the other hand, we've got the way people generally think about the conditions that we're in. Is it a default thinking that we're going into, either our own or that of society? And once we take this challenge to our thinking, to look at our thinking and be really, Steiner uses the word that I'll quote later on, can we nerve ourselves to inner honesty as to what kind of quality of thinking we are coming out of? And once we begin to become aware of our own thinking and other people's thinking, how on earth do we manage that in a social sense? Well, I would like to quote Maya Angelou, who I consider a towering individual and poet from the US. She was a prominent Black activist, author, actress, storyteller in the 20th and early 21st century. And this is her poem on change. She's a bit of the caliber of a John the Baptist. Change by Maya Angelou. There were people who went to sleep last night, poor and rich and white and black, but they will never wake again. And those dead folks would give anything at all for just 5 minutes of this weather or 10 minutes of ploughing. So you watch yourself about complaining. What you're supposed to do when you don't like a thing is change it. If you can't change it, change the way you think about it. So this begins to direct us into ourselves, and the big question of how on earth do we deal with all the different opinions about what is happening around us. And then I've turned again to Rudolf Steiner for his advice on this matter, because turning for thought that is directed outwardly to a change of thinking can cause a change of heart for us. And Rudolf Steiner talks about this in the inner aspect of the social question, the lecture he gave on the 11th of February 1919. And taking up this fire that Jennifer talked about and the clarity, he says, in a social situation, we can sorry, I'll start again. In a social situation, he says that we can kindle love, a true interest in the other, by a change of thinking that is achieved in our inner life. And he gives this very strong pathway for us to deal with all this diversity of opinion and thinking that we meet in a time of change. And this is to quote him: "We must strive for inner honesty. We must nerve ourselves to the inner honesty to say, since the mystery of Golgotha, we have not been born free from prejudice with regard to our world of thought. We are all born with certain prejudices. And how can this change be, how can we manage to do this inner honesty?" And he says, instead of taking an interest merely in my own way of thinking and in what I consider right, I must develop a selfless interest in every opinion I encounter, however strongly I may hold it to be mistaken. The Christ never ceases to reveal himself anew to human beings, even unto the end of earthly time. And so he speaks today to those willing to listen. In whatever the least of your brethren thinks, you must recognize that I am thinking in them, and that I enter into your feelings, your heart, whenever you have a feeling of sisterhood through interest for what is passing in another's soul. And then Steiner says, whatever opinion, whatever outlook on life you discover in the least of your brethren, in that you are seeking the Christ. So does the Christ speak to our life of thought. So just to sum it up, in this thinking that brings innovation and invention, in thinking that strives to meet the ever-changing world in which we live, so that we all come with our different conclusions and views and ideas about it, that Steiner's advice to grow community is that we take such an interest in each other and the other person's view that there we will find the Christ, particularly if we don't agree with it. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Cheryl. So what we're going to do now, as I said earlier, we're not going to have small discussion groups. We're not going to go to breakout rooms. Instead, we've been given an enormous amount from these to work with, which we can, of course, I don't expect us to work with now, but of course, we will take it into sleep tonight. So instead of discussion groups and dispersing into talking, we're just going to spend 5 minutes or so looking at 3 artworks from artists from the art section who have offered these artworks. And when I say artworks, I don't necessarily mean, you know, big things that go, you know, into galleries, but they are how they worked artistically with these themes at this time of year. So, and we'll just sit quietly, as Jennifer said earlier, just that sitting quietly, looking at them, or you know, I'm not going to tell you what they are, or just that you allow them to work upon you as much as they can through this medium of the screen. And we'll do that for about, as I said, for about just a minute or about 2 minutes or so on each one before we will come to the end of the gathering and a few announcements I have to make. So I'd like to thank the three presenters again. It's not easy to speak about spiritual matters at any time to an audience in a lecture form or to find the right words. It's particularly this topic of St. John the Baptist or the St. John's Tide, which so often that we tend to celebrate, say, in the schools with a winter spiral or a bonfire or something like that, where we look more at the seasonal rather than the spiritual impulse. And it's particularly difficult, as those of you who have been presenters know, it's particularly difficult to speak on this medium and really feel that you are able to not just bring something spiritual, but to bring it through this very difficult technological platform and share it with others. So I would like to thank those three people very warmly for the wonderful work they just gave to us. And hopefully you will also put that in the chat or send them an email afterwards thanking them for their work. So thank you. Just to some practical things before Yasushi finishes with a verse for us. I have two events coming up in the end of July and the middle of August that I would just like to draw your attention to. So I'll just bring up the slides again. We have the annual general meeting to vote for the new General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society coming up in mid-August. Now it's in Canberra from 10:30 to 3:30 p.m. You will be receiving quite shortly some information about this, which the management group asks that you read this information and you read it carefully. So, and if you cannot come to the AGM, although it's going to be streamed on Zoom, it won't be interactive. So in order to vote, you will need to, as it says down the bottom here, those who wish to vote must do so by postal vote or by email vote by August the 3rd. But there is a newsletter coming out from Mark Gallaher fairly quite soon, and I expect by early July, I think it is, that there is going to be, you will receive the information that you would, as I said, the management group would like you to read. So look out for that, that's mid-August. Now, the other thing I'd like to mention, at the risk of spruiking myself, is that Neil Anderson, who is, many of you know, who has spoken at some of these online gatherings through the verse, he and I are offering papers at an interdisciplinary symposium on phenomenology and climate change, a 2-day interdisciplinary symposium that will explore the wider cultural, and I stress that it's a cultural context, since neither of us are scientists, the wider cultural context of climate change. And it's hosted by Sydney Uni, and Neil has been very instrumental in getting this off the ground, because both of us are going to talk about Goethean phenomenology. We're actually both giving 2 papers on Friday and Saturday. It is online, it's online all day long. I'm not entirely, I can't remember at this point what time we're on, but if you are interested, I can send you the details, or you can contact Neil, or I can give you his email. So as I said, this is, I think, taking Goethean phenomenology and anthroposophy into a public forum to speak about this a topic very close and very immediate in our current situation. So, oh, and I should also mention, if you, that Jennifer said that the notes for her talk will be available afterwards when I put out the recording, and we can send out the notes. I'll also put them on the community notice board, where I also always put the recording. The recording won't be coming out probably at least till next weekend, I'm afraid, because I'm moving house this coming week, but it will come out shortly. So Yasushi, if you would like to, I'll bring up the verse.
See, I send my angel before you. He is to prepare your way. The voice of one calling in the loneliness. Prepare the way for the Lord. Make sure that his paths are straight.
Thank you. Thank you, Sushi. Thank you to the artists who offered their work. Thank you to the presenters, and thank you to everybody who came along today to be with us. So I'd like to say good night now.